Let's take a look at what macro expert George Gammon says about the possibility of a recession.
Everybody in the mainstream media has been talking about how we are no longer going to have a recession, but the data would suggest they are completely wrong. As a matter of fact, I think the person who sums up this view very, very well is none other than Joe Biden himself. Editor, let's go to a recent quote from our president. Overall, Americans are living more abundantly than they ever have before today. More than 2.5 million new jobs were created just in the past year alone. That's the biggest percentage increase in nearly 20 years. People are earning more than they ever have before in history. Despite this record of achievement, as we turn to the future, we hear once again the familiar voice of the perennial prophets of gloom, telling us now that because of the need to fight inflation, because of the energy crisis, America may be headed for a recession. Let me speak to that issue head on, he says. There will be no recession in the United States of America. And I'd like to emphasize where he said there will be no recession in the United States. Now, maybe some of you caught what I was doing right there. You see, that quote, or part of a speech, was not from Joe Biden. That was from President Richard Nixon when he was addressing the country in January of 1974. And I would like to point out that the United States officially went into a recession in November of 1973. So as the president was saying that we will not go into a recession, we were actually in a recession. And oh, by the way, the yield curve was inverted back then, just like it's inverted today. History might not repeat, but it sure does rhyme.
Like Richard Nixon in 1974, Ben Bernanke in February of 2008, then head of the Federal Reserve, said that he sees no recession happening in 2008. Well, as it turns out, looking back on the data, the recession started in December of 2007. These academics and politicians are clueless. They not only can't predict a recession, they can't even post-dict one. In this interesting clip, Michelle McCory from Kitco News is interviewing George Gammon, and she asks him about why he thinks Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, is selling $140 million of his shares. I think George's answer is really interesting, but in particular, pay attention to what he says about the yield curve.
And perhaps coincidentally, or not coincidentally, we're learning that Jamie Dimon, for the first time, is selling 1 million shares of JP Morgan.
$140 million worth.
So this represents about a 12% stake of his overall holdings in JP Morgan. He has been using the ownership of his shares for several years as a vote of confidence in JP Morgan. In the SEC filing, they said that, this is no reflection on...
Of course. What are they going to say, right?
But what do you make of that? What do you make of the fact that, this is to happen in early next year, because when you have that many shares, you got to say in advance when you're planning on selling them, and JP Morgan shares doing exceptionally well. What do you make of the fact that this timing sort of coincides?
I think it's a huge red flag. I don't know how you could take it any other way, because let's just go through that thought experiment that Jamie Dimon is retiring and he wants to cash out some of his chips and whatnot. Okay, look, if you were very bullish on JP Morgan and the overall banking system, why would you sell those shares? Who cares if you're retiring? Wouldn't you still want the greatest return on your savings that you could possibly get? And if you felt that was the best risk reward, then why on earth would you sell?
Arguably, just to play devil's advocate, he needs the cash to buy his beautiful beachfront retirement home.
Borrow against the shares. Then you don't have to pay taxes.
Interest rates are higher. I'm not saying what he's going to use the cash to pay, for maybe not a house where you have some tax incentives. I don't know.
Yeah, just borrow. That's what rich people do.
Yeah.
Is they borrow against their assets so they don't have to sell those assets and absorb the capital gains. So that would be my rebuttal. That would be the highest probable outcome or the highest probable motivation behind him taking that action if your devil's advocate case was actually the truth. But I think that, again, if I'm just using common sense, my base case would be that he sees a massive red flag. Look, and let's look at some of the other data points. We've got a curve that's massively inverted, for heaven's sakes. Yes, we've had a bear steepener as of the last, 2 or 3 months, but we still got the 10-year trading at, call it, 50 basis points under Fed funds? I mean, it's 40 basis points under reverse repo. That is a huge, huge sign that the health of the global economy is very, very poor right now, and it's getting worse. I mean, you look at what's going on in Europe. They're in absolute recession. You look at what's going on in China. I mean, they're on the brink of collapse, for heaven's sakes. And if that happens, I don't know how the US avoids that. So, and then plus, you've got the BTFP that we were talking about. You don't think Jamie Dimon knows about that?
Sure he does.
Absolutely. So he's sitting there looking at all of his buddies in the banking system, and they're sitting there saying, holy cow, I don't know what is going to happen in 2024. The stuff could absolutely hit the fan. And then he's looking at history, and he's seeing that, oh, wow, every single time we get an inversion, let's say the 3-month and the 10-month, or excuse me, the 3-month and the 10-year, we usually have a recession, not months afterward. No. Usually it takes at least 18 to 24 months before the stuff actually hits the fan. You know, you go back to the inversion that we had prior to the GFC. I don't have the chart in front of me, but if my memory serves me well, the curve actually inverted in 2006. And we didn't have all that stuff happen until the middle, let's say, of 2008. This stuff never happens overnight. It always takes a long time to play out. So let's say 18 to 24 months. So Jamie Dimon is well aware of this. So he's sitting there looking at his share price, maybe looking at retirement. I don't know. I think he's more so looking at how do I take some of my chips off the table so they're not subject to a complete crash in the overall system and the share price going down by, who knows, 70, 80%. I think that's more.
I think it's not only possible, but probable that we're going to have a deep recession in 2024. Let's take a look at this clip from Peter Schiff where he shares with us his view on why this will happen.
What's amazing to me is that you've got so many people who are looking at this situation where rates have gone from 0 to above 5%. And they somehow think that we could get away without having a recession, because soft landing means that we don't have a recession. Well, why would that be? So you look at the difficulty the Fed has had in normalizing rates and look at the recessions. And in fact, in 2008-9, that was the Great Recession, when the Fed tried to normalize rates after keeping them at 1% for a year and a half or whatever it was, and then slowly normalizing rates back up above 5%. That produced the worst recession since the Great Depression. So why would anybody believe that the Fed can normalize rates now and not have a similar consequence? Now, if interest rates were low for natural reasons, for reasons having nothing to do with the Fed, that means there's money available to finance long-term investments, so that businesses can borrow money to build a capital that will produce goods in the future. That is not the environment that we're in. There are no frugal Americans. We're living for now. Everybody is profligate. Nobody cares about the future. People want to buy stuff right now. Nobody wants to wait. They want to buy now and pay later, or buy now and pay never. So we don't have an economy that would naturally have low interest rates. And if you naturally have low interest rates, then the decisions that are made and the investments that are made can be supported. In the 2008 period, right, we had low interest rates, artificially low interest rates for 2005 and 6 and 7. A lot of the mistakes that were made as a result of that were focused or concentrated in the real estate market. Too many people bought too many homes. They bought homes they couldn't afford. They took on mortgages they couldn't really afford. It was a speculative mania. Banks loaned money to borrowers that really couldn't repay. But nobody was thinking properly when everybody was impacted by these artificially low interest rates. When that period came to an end, 2007, 2008, everything collapsed. But my point is that if we had a great recession, when the Fed went from 1% to 5%, if that rate hike produced the Great Recession, why would people think that this time we're going to get away with not having a recession at all. Even though this time the Fed didn't stop at 1. It went all the way down to 0. And it left rates at 0 for more than a decade.
Here, Peter gives an analogy on why the Fed's artificially low interest rates are like having the circus come to town.
Say, look, imagine you run a restaurant and then a circus comes to town. And so now there's all these extra people. And let's say all the people in the circus, while they're in town, they start eating out at my restaurant. And now all of a sudden, my restaurant is really busy. I've got a lot more people at my restaurant than I normally have. It's crowded. Maybe people are waiting, outside for a table. And so I look at this and I misinterpret these signals. Maybe I don't even realize that the circus is in town. I just see a lot of people, at my restaurant. And I'm like, wow, this is great. My restaurant's really popular. I need to expand. And so maybe I rent some extra space. Maybe there's, some space next door. And so I expand my restaurant so I can put in more tables. I hire some more waiters or, people to handle this big increase in my business. So I do all this stuff. I make these investments. I hire people. And everything is good. And then, the circus leaves. They pull up their stakes and they pack everything up and they go to the next town. Well, now what happens? It's a bust. My restaurant is empty now, right? The customers are gone. And so now I realize, I screwed up, And so what do I got to do? I got to try to get rid of the extra space that I took out. I got to lay off some workers that I never should have hired because my decisions were influenced by this circus that distorted stuff. Well, that's what happens with the Fed. The Fed artificially lowers interest rates, and that sends out false signals, like the circus sent out false signals that there was more demand for my restaurant. No, there really wasn't more demand. It was just temporary.
So to sum it up, we've had absurdly low interest rates for more than a decade, resulting in tons of bad investments in the economy. Now that interest rates are higher, the economy must correct those bad investments, which is going to result in a painful recession. I think that after seeing these perspectives and also seeing that housing prices are starting to come down a lot, and in addition to that, these huge student loan payments are resuming, plus you see consumer credit card debt going up like crazy and defaults increasing like crazy too. So with those things combined, I think it's very likely that we're going to be heading into a recession. But let's take a look at this clip from Adrian Day, where he shares with us when this might happen.
Well, I looked at all of the recessions going back to the 1960s. And if you look at the time from when the Fed first raised rates, the initial rate hike, to when the recession started, it's an average of 22 months. So that's the average. And I would posit that this one should even be longer.
So Adrian mentions that the average time, based on his research, from the time of the first rate hike to the time the recession starts is 22 months. So you have all these people saying that there's going to be a soft landing, but we haven't even gotten to the 22-month mark yet, which would mark the average amount of time. So the first rate hike in this rate hiking cycle was mid-March 2022. So fast forward 22 months later, and you're looking at mid-January 2024. But Adrian goes on to say why he thinks that it may take even longer than 22 months this time around.
Higher for longer is tightening, because as you keep rates high for a long period of time, more and more companies, more and more households get into that higher interest rate vortex. So you only have to look at, for example, corporations. So you look at corporate debt. And relatively little corporate debt came due this year. But you look at next year, it's almost twice as much comes due. And if you look at 2025, it's another 50% on top of 2024. So if they keep rates high throughout 24 and into 25, then more and more corporations who've escaped the higher interest rate, it might affect their customers, but it doesn't affect their balance sheet. They've escaped it because they rolled over their debt for 3 years or 5 years or whatever it was. More and more corporations are bought into and have to refinance. And if a company, a good quality company, refinanced 5 years ago, they were probably paying 3% maybe. Now they'll be paying 8%.
So I think it's pretty clear that a recession is coming, but how do you invest in a recession? Well, if you would like to know what I'm personally doing with my own money, go to miningstockmonkey.com and sign up for my free newsletter. And watch this video next. It's 17 of Rick Rule's best tips to make money in gold and silver stocks.